The dog was dying. Not slowly, not quietly. It was shaking on the cold stone floor of the barn with a sound that was more like a whisper than a cry, as if it had already decided that being too loud would cost it the last energy it had. It was smaller than a man's fist, its ribs pushed against its thin skin like tiny fingers trying to get out. The other pups in the litter had already pushed it to the far edge of the pile, away from warmth, away from their mother's side. None of them had done it out of cruelty. They had done it because that is what survival looks like before it has a name. Mara Elliott saw all of this from the open barn door before anyone knew she was there. She had come to deliver eggs to the Callaway farm, same as she did every Tuesday. She had not planned to stop. She had not planned to care. But the moment her eyes found that tiny, trembling shape in the corner of the barn floor, she forgot about the eggs entirely. She walked straight in, knelt on the cold stone without thinking, and placed her hand gently over the pup's back. It flinched. Then, it was still. Then, very slowly, it pressed itself into the warmth of her palm. Mara was 31 years old. She lived alone in a small cottage at the end of a gravel road that most people in Carroll Valley had given up bothering to drive down. She was not shy, exactly, but she was quiet, in a way that people sometimes mistook for distance. She made her living selling handmade knitted goods at the Saturday market. Scarves, mittens, baby blankets, the occasional sweater. She did not make a lot of money. She did not need a lot. What she had was enough, and what she gave away was more than most people noticed. The farm belonged to the Callaways, and the dog was one of several litters they bred each season. Border collies, working dogs, animals that were expected to earn their place. Old Pete Callaway came into the barn while Mara was still kneeling and watched her for a moment before he said anything. "That one won't make it," he said, not unkindly, just honestly, the way farmers say things that are hard to hear. "Has anyone tried?" Mara asked. Pete took off his hat and turned it in his hands. "There's no point trying with a runt like that. You know how it goes." Mara looked down at the pup. It had stopped shaking as much. Its tiny nose twitched. "Can I take it?" she asked. Pete looked at her, the way most people in Carroll Valley looked at Mara when she said or did something that didn't match their expectations of her. Not mean, not mocking, just uncertain. "You can take it," he said. "But don't expect a miracle." She drove home with the pup wrapped in the wool scarf she had been wearing around her own neck. She kept the heat in her truck turned up as high as it would go. The pup slept the entire drive, which she told herself was a good sign. It probably was not a good sign. But Mara had a habit of choosing to believe the better version of things until the worse version proved itself beyond doubt. She did not think this was foolishness. She thought it was the only honest way to live. She set up a small box near the wood stove and lined it with an old wool sweater that had lost its shape but kept its warmth. She fed the pup every 2 hours through the first night, using a small syringe she had bought years ago for a cat that had needed the same kind of attention and had lived to be 14. By morning, the pup had not died. By the end of the second day, it had started to make noise, a low, grumbling little sound that was not quite a growl and not quite a cry, but something between the two. Mara named it nothing yet. She was practical enough to know that naming something was a kind of promise, and she wasn't ready to make that promise until she was sure the pup wanted to stay. By the end of the first week, she knew. The pup had started pulling itself to the edge of the box and standing on legs that shook like new grass in wind. It fell. It got back up. It fell again. It looked at Mara with dark eyes that were too serious and too aware for something that small, and something in those eyes made her feel as though she was being studied, rather than the other way around. "All right," she said one evening, watching it try for the 5th time to climb out of the box and fail. "You're clearly not interested in giving up." She reached in and lifted it carefully. It growled at her. A real growl this time, low and certain, like a rumble from something much larger than it was. She laughed because she couldn't help it. The sound of it seemed to surprise the pup too. She called Pete Callaway the next morning. "The runt is going to live," she said. There was a pause. Then Pete said, "I'll be." Word traveled, because in Carroll Valley, it always did. The woman at the end of the gravel road had taken in one of the Callaway runts and the thing was pulling through. People said it the way they said most things in small places, as a fact, but also as a question. As in, what are you going to do with a dog like that? As in, what does a woman like her need with a working dog? Mara did not hear most of it. She was busy keeping the wood stove fed, refilling the syringe, and watching the pup try to terrorize the legs of her kitchen chairs with a ferocity that was genuinely impressive for something that still fit in a coat pocket. She named it nothing for 3 more weeks. And then, one cold Sunday morning, she watched it plant all 4 of its wobbling legs on the kitchen floor, lift its chin, and growl at absolutely nothing. At the empty air, at the world, at whatever forces it imagined were standing in its way. And she thought, that is not nothing. That is something with a very strong opinion about itself. She named it Grit, not because it was a dog name, because it was the only word that fit. What she did not know, on that Sunday morning, was that the name had already traveled. Pete Calloway had mentioned the pup's survival to a man he saw at the feed store. That man had mentioned it to another man, and that other man was the kind of man whose name, in Caro Valley, tended to make a room go slightly quieter when it was spoken. His name was Owen Holt, and he bred the best working dogs in the valley, and possibly in the 3 counties surrounding it. Mara had heard his name, of course. Everyone had. She had seen him exactly once, from a distance, at the Saturday market, where he had been buying something at the hardware stand, and had looked, from across the square, like a man who was physically incapable of being uncertain about anything. He was tall. He was broad-shouldered. He moved through a crowd the way rivers move around rocks, not aggressively, but with a steadiness that made it clear the crowd was what would shift. She had thought nothing further about him. She was too busy watching Grit try to eat the fringe off her best wool rug. Owen Holt, for his part, had thought nothing further about her either. But 3 weeks later, on a morning that started like any other, he drove down the gravel road for the first time, parked his truck in front of her cottage, and sat in the driver's seat for a moment, looking at the smoke coming from the chimney. He had come because of the dog. He had not come because of anything else. That, at least, was what he told himself. He knocked on the door. He heard a sharp, immediate bark from inside. Too low for a small dog, too certain for a frightened one. And then the door opened, and Mara Elliott looked up at him with the calm expression of a woman who was not particularly impressed by much, and said, "Can I help you?" Owen looked past her shoulder at the small, dark-eyed dog sitting behind her legs and staring at him with an expression that was, he thought, somewhere between territorial and genuinely unafraid. "I heard about the Runt," he said. "A lot of people have," she said. "I'd like to see it." "Him," she said. "His name is Grit." Owen looked at her then, properly, and she looked back at him with the same steady calm. "May I come in?" he asked. She stepped aside. Not because she was uncertain, but because she was curious. Owen Holt stepped over the threshold of Mara Elliott's cottage, and Grit did not run. He did not hide. He walked 3 steps forward, sat down directly in front of the largest man he had ever seen in his 8 weeks of life, and growled. Owen crouched down slowly. He extended one hand, backside facing up, the way you do with a dog you want to read honestly. Grit sniffed it, then bit it. Not hard, but meaningfully. Owen looked up at Mara. She was almost smiling. "He does that," she said. "I know," Owen said, and something in his voice had shifted slightly, though he would not have been able to say exactly when or why. "He's something." "He is," Mara agreed. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the pines at the edge of the gravel road. Inside, the wood stove clicked and settled, and Grit, apparently satisfied that he had made his position clear, turned around, walked back to his wool-lined bed near the fire, turned 3 times, and lay down, as if the matter were settled. As if he had already decided how this story would go. Owen Holt had not planned to stay longer than 10 minutes. He stayed for nearly an hour. It was not Mara that kept him, or rather, it was not only Mara, it was Grit. He watched the small dog move around the cottage with a kind of focused intensity that Owen recognized from the best animals he had ever worked with. There was nothing random about how Grit moved. He checked the corners of each room before settling. He tracked every sound from outside with his ears before reacting to it. When a branch scraped the window in the wind, most small dogs would have barked at the ceiling or run behind a chair. Grit turned his head, located the source, looked at it for exactly 2 seconds, and then dismissed it. He had already decided it was nothing. He moved on. Owen watched all of this from the wooden chair near the fire that Mara had offered him without ceremony, setting a cup of tea on the side table, and then sitting across from him in her own chair with her knitting in her hands, as if having the most well-known dog breeder in the county sitting in her living room was entirely ordinary. "How long has he been walking?" Owen asked, watching Grit circle the room again. "Properly. About a week," Mara said. "He was a little wobbly at first, but he got over it quickly. He doesn't like being wobbly. It bothers him." Owen leaned forward, with his elbows on his knees, and looked at Grit directly. Grit stopped. He looked back. Neither of them looked away for a long moment, and then Grit walked very deliberately to the center of the room, between Mara and Owen, and sat down, facing Owen. "He's deciding what you are," Mara said quietly. "I know," Owen said. "Most people would try to call him over, offer him something, try to win him. That's the wrong approach with a dog like this," Owen said. "It is," she agreed. Owen finally looked away from Grit and looked at Mara instead. She was knitting without looking at her hands, which meant she had been doing it long enough that the motion was like breathing. Her eyes were light brown, or possibly green. It was hard to tell in the firelight. She was not what he had expected, though he would have struggled to say what he had expected. The valley had described her in the way small communities describe people who live quietly and independently, fondly, but vaguely, as though the details of her life were less interesting than the fact that she lived it differently. "You're the woman who sells things at the Saturday market," he said. "I am," she said. "The knitting." "Mostly," she said. He looked at the yarn in her hands. It was a deep green, thick and sturdy. She was working with a kind of efficiency that made it clear she was not decorating time. She was working. This was what she did. This was her livelihood, and she treated it with the same practical respect that he gave his breeding records and training schedules. He understood that. He respected it before he had even thought about whether to. "What are you making?" he asked. She looked down at the piece in her hands, and then up at Grit and said nothing for a moment. "Something that might be useful," she said. He did not ask further. It was not his nature to push into spaces where he had not been invited. He finished his tea, stood, and thanked her in a way that was brief but genuine. At the door, he looked back at Grit, who had followed them both to the hallway, and was sitting at Mara's heel, watching Owen the way a much larger dog would, with patience and authority rather than excitement. "He's going to be a remarkable animal," Owen said. "He already is," said Mara. Owen drove home thinking about the dog. He told himself, very firmly, that he was thinking only about the dog. His ranch was 12 minutes east of Mara's cottage, and about 100 acres wider than anything she could see from her windows. He ran it with a quiet efficiency that impressed people who understood what running a place like that actually required. The early mornings, the constant small decisions, the way you had to hold 3 different timelines in your head at once, because the animals were always in different stages of health, age, and training. He had 2 farmhands, a part-time vet who came Thursdays, and a dog named Colonel who was 7 years old and had been with him long enough to understand things without being told. Colonel was the reason people called Owen what they called him. Not that Owen had chosen the name. You did not choose a name like that for yourself in a community like Caro Valley. The community decided it, the same way it decided everything, slowly, by observation, then all at once, as if it had always been true. Owen had been breeding and training working dogs since he was 19 years old, first on his father's land and then on his own. He had a reputation for producing dogs that other breeders could not because he had any particular secret, but because he paid attention in a way that most people did not sustain over years. He watched, he waited. He never forced an animal towards something it was not built to become. He had been told this approach was unusual. He thought it was simply honest. The name had started as a joke at a livestock show 6 years ago, when Owen's dog had outperformed every other animal in the field by margins that people kept quietly recalculating on their programs because the numbers seemed wrong. Someone had said, "That man runs his dogs like a kingdom, and his lead dog is the king." Someone else had turned it around. "If the dog is the king, what does that make the man?" "The alpha," someone said. "The one above the king. The alpha. The one who made everything run." By the time Owen drove home from the Callaway show that day, 3 people had called him it to his face. He had not corrected them. He had not encouraged it either. He was simply Owen Holt, who paid attention and waited and worked hard, and if the Valley wanted to give that a dramatic title, he could not stop them. What he could stop was caring about it. He cared only about the work. The week after his first visit to Mara's cottage, he went back. He told himself it was because he wanted to check on Grit's progress. This was true. It was also not the complete truth, but Owen was a practical man, and he allowed himself only one layer of honesty at a time. Mara answered the door in her work clothes, a thick wool cardigan, paint on one sleeve from something she had been fixing on the fence, her hair in a loose knot. She did not look surprised to see him. She did not look particularly delighted either. She simply stepped back from the door and said, "He's in the kitchen. He found the bottom shelf of the pantry this morning and rearranged everything on it." Owen followed her inside. The kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and something baking. Grit was sitting on the kitchen floor with the expression of a dog who had recently done something and was confident it had been the right decision. On the floor beside him were 3 tins that had been moved from the pantry shelf to positions that made no sense to anyone except Grit. Owen sat down on the kitchen floor. Not on a chair, on the floor. Mara looked at him. "It's easier," he said, "if you're at the same level." She did not say anything. She pulled out a chair and sat in it, watching as Owen settled cross-legged on her kitchen floor, and waited. Grit looked at him. Owen looked back. Then Grit walked over, smelled Owen's boot very thoroughly, and then, without any fuss, climbed onto Owen's knee, turned around once, and sat down. Mara felt something go slightly quiet inside her chest. She had not expected that. Nobody who had seen Grit so far had earned that. Not Pete Calloway, who had stopped by to check on the pup out of honest curiosity. Not her neighbor, Carol, who had visited twice with dog treats she thought might help. Not even Mara herself had gotten that level of voluntary trust from Grit without days of patient earning. Owen had sat down on the floor. That was all. He had sat on the floor and waited. And Grit had made his decision. Owen sat very still and did not reach out to stroke the dog. He just let the warmth of the contact be enough for now. He looked up at Mara, and she looked back at him, and something passed between them that neither of them named, because neither of them was ready to name it, and naming things before they were ready was the kind of thing that made them go wrong. "He's putting on weight," Owen said. "Almost 2 pounds this week," she said. "His legs are straight now. No wobble." No. He decided he was done with wobbling around day 10. The corner of Owen's mouth moved. Good. They talked about the dog for a while. Owen asked precise, knowledgeable questions about Grit's eating schedule, his sleep, his reactions to new sounds. Mara answered precisely. She had been keeping a small notebook, which she showed him without embarrassment. Neat rows of times and observations, the kind of record-keeping that Owen recognized immediately as the work of someone who understood that the details mattered. He was more impressed than he showed. He showed a little, though. "You didn't have to do this," he said, looking at the notebook. "I know," she said. "I do it because I want to understand him, not because I have to." Owen looked at Grit, still settled on his knee, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Most people treat animals as problems to solve or pleasures to enjoy. They don't try to understand them as," he paused, "as themselves." "I know," Mara said again. "You're not most people," he said. It was not a compliment in the way a person gives a compliment to impress someone. It was an observation, the kind you make when you have been paying attention, and you want the person to know you have. Mara looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "I'm not." He stayed another hour. He sat on her kitchen floor for most of it, which she found more disarming than she wanted to admit. A man that size, that known, sitting easily on a stone floor because it was the honest way to be with an animal. It was not what she had expected from the man the Valley called what it called him. He left at midday, and she stood in the doorway and watched his truck drive back up the gravel road. Grit sat at her heel and watched too, his chin slightly lifted, his small chest out. When the truck was out of sight, she picked Grit up and held him against her chest. "What do you think?" she said. Grit looked at her with his 2 serious eyes and said nothing. "I know," she said. "I'm not sure either." Inside, on the kitchen table, the green knitting was folded neatly beside her needles. She had finished the main body of it 3 days ago. She only had the collar left to do, and then the small reinforced strip along the bottom that would keep it from riding up on a dog that moved as quickly and sharply as Grit did. She had measured him carefully. She had thought about the shape of him, the width of his chest, the length of his back, the way he moved when he was at full speed. She had chosen the wool for its weight and warmth, not its softness. This was not decorative. This was practical. She sat down and picked up her needles. Outside, the valley went about its afternoon. The pines moved in the wind. A crow called twice from somewhere above the tree line. And Mara knitted, and thought, and did not yet decide what any of it meant. The sweater was done on a Thursday. Mara held it up in the morning light that came through the kitchen window, turning it slowly, checking every seam. The forest green wool was dense and even, the kind of knitting that took years to get right, not tight enough to restrict, not loose enough to snag. The collar was ribbed and slightly wider at the back, so it would sit flat along the neck without pulling. The underbelly had a double layer, reinforced without adding bulk, because she had watched Grit move for weeks now, and she knew that he was low to the ground when he ran, and the ground in Caro Valley was cold and rough, and full of things that would catch a thin fabric and ruin it. She had not told Owen she was making it. She had not told anyone. She set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment. Then she called Grit, who came from the hallway where he had been conducting one of his inspections. He did a circuit of the cottage every morning now, checking every corner with the focus of a dog 3 times his age. He trotted into the kitchen, saw the green thing on the table, and sat down in front of it. He sniffed the air in its direction. "I made that for you," Mara said. Grit looked at her. "It's cold," she said, as if he had asked for an explanation. "And you're still small. You lose heat faster than you should." Grit continued to look at her, with his dark, unblinking eyes. She crouched down and held the sweater out to him. He sniffed it thoroughly, her hands, the wool, the collar, the seams. It took about 45 seconds. Then he looked up at her. "May I?" she asked. She always asked. She did not know when she had started doing that with him, but she had, and she thought it was the right thing. He did not flinch when she slipped it over his head. He stood still, while she guided his front legs through. She straightened the collar, smoothed the back, checked that the underbelly strip lay flat. Then she stepped back. Grit stood in the middle of the kitchen floor, in his forest green sweater, and looked at her. She looked at him. He looked down at himself once, not with confusion, not with offense. Just a single glance, the way a person might check that their coat is buttoned before they go out. Then he lifted his chin and walked to the back door, where he stood waiting for his morning run in the yard. Mara laughed, a short, bright sound that surprised even her. She opened the door. Grit went outside and ran. He ran the full perimeter of the yard, which he always did, nose down, ears up. Then he came back and sat at her feet and looked up at her as if to say, "Ready." She watched him for a moment in the thin winter light, his dark coat and the deep green wool, his small, serious face with that expression she had come to read as clearly as a sentence. She thought about what Owen had said the week before, when he had dropped off a bag of the specific puppy food he used at his ranch. He had not called ahead. He had simply arrived, set the bag on the porch, and when she opened the door, he had said, "He needs more fat content in his diet this month. This is what I use." As if they had already agreed that he was involved in Grit's care. As if that was already decided. She had said, "Thank you," not because she had needed the advice. She had already begun adjusting Grit's food, but because he had brought it without being asked. And that meant something, even when you did not say so. She put on her coat and took a photograph of Grit in the yard. She did it quietly, on her phone, and then stood looking at the image. A small black and white dog in a forest green sweater, standing on frost-covered grass, chin up, completely comfortable in himself. She sent it to Pete Calloway with no message attached. He called her 3 minutes later. "Is that the Runt?" he said. "His name is Grit," she said. A pause. "He looks..." Another pause. She could hear Pete choosing his words the way he always did, carefully, from a small selection. "He looks like he belongs to himself." "He does," she said. "That sweater is something. It keeps him warm." Pete was quiet for another moment. Then, "Mara, that is a remarkable little dog." "I know," she said, and she was smiling when she hung up. What she did not know was what Pete did next. He called Owen Holt. Not because he was a gossip, Pete Calloway was the opposite of a gossip. He said only what was true, and only when it mattered, which was exactly why Owen always answered when Pete called. Pete told Owen about the photograph in the same brief, factual way he told Owen about everything, that Mara had knitted the dog a sweater, forest green, and the dog was wearing it in the yard, and the dog looked, Pete said, like something you would want to see with your own eyes. Owen said he would stop by. He said it calmly. He drove there the next morning less calmly. He was not sure why he felt what he felt on that short drive, and because he was Owen Holt, he did not spend time asking himself. He simply arrived, knocked, and waited. Mara opened the door. She was wearing the same thick cardigan she always seemed to be wearing in the mornings, her hair loose this time, a mug of something hot in one hand. She looked at him with the expression he was beginning to recognize as her default. Calm. Present. Not surprised by anything, but not pretending to have expected it either. "Come in," she said. He followed her to the kitchen. Grit was already standing in the middle of the room, looking at the door, which meant he had heard the truck on the gravel from some distance away. He had been waiting. And he was wearing the sweater. Owen stopped. He had seen the photograph. He had thought he was prepared. He was not prepared. It was not simply that the sweater was well made, though it clearly was. It was not even the color, though the green against Grit's dark coat was striking. It was the way Grit wore it. The dog stood with all 4 feet planted squarely on the kitchen floor and looked up at Owen the way he always did, straight on, without apology, with that flat-footed certainty that Owen had never seen in a dog this young. The sweater did not make Grit look small. It did not make him look dressed up or managed or decorated. It made him look like himself, only more clearly, like someone had framed a painting that was already good, and the frame had made the painting easier to see. Owen crouched down slowly. Grit walked to him. Not trotted, walked, with a measured pace that was purely Grit. Nothing hurried, nothing uncertain. He stopped a foot from Owen and sat down and looked at him. Owen looked back. "You made this," Owen said. He was looking at Grit, but the words were for Mara. "I did," she said. "When?" "Over the last few weeks. I finished it Thursday." Owen reached out one hand, very slowly, and touched the edge of the sweater's collar. Grit allowed it. He sat still while Owen's rough hand examined the seam at the shoulder, the reinforced strip at the bottom, the double layer at the chest. Owen was looking at it the way he looked at everything, with the full weight of his attention, taking in the detail before he responded to it. "This is not a simple thing to knit," he said finally. "No," Mara agreed. "The underbelly is reinforced." He was not asking, he had already seen it. "He's low when he runs," she said. "The ground is rough." Owen looked up at her. She was leaning in the kitchen doorway with her mug, watching him with that steady expression, he thought. She did not make this because she was asked. She made this because she understood the dog, and because understanding something was, for her, not a stopping point, but a starting point. She had looked at Grit and seen not just what he was, but what he would need. That was, Owen thought, an unusual kind of seeing. "Has he worn it before today?" Owen asked. "Since Thursday morning," she said. "He slept in it. He ran in it yesterday in the rain. I offered to take it off and dry it, and he gave me a look that I chose to respect." Owen made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "What kind of look?" "The kind that means he's made a decision, and my opinion about that decision is interesting, but ultimately not relevant." This time Owen did laugh. A quiet, short sound that he did not seem aware of making. He looked at Grit, who was still sitting in front of him with an expression of patient authority. "He's going to be a serious animal," Owen said. "He already is," Mara said. She said it the same way she had said it the first day Owen had come, as though the fact were settled and had been settled for some time. Owen stayed longer than he meant to again. He and Mara sat at the kitchen table with their own mugs. She had poured him tea without asking, which he found he did not mind at all. And Grit moved between them with the proprietary ease of a dog who understood that both of these people were in his space, and he was generous enough to allow it. They talked about dogs. Owen talked about Colonel, who was aging and beginning to slow in a way that was visible now on cold mornings. Mara listened carefully, asking small, precise questions, and Owen found himself saying more than he had intended to, not because she had asked him to, but because the way she listened made it feel worth saying. He told her about the first dog he had ever trained when he was 16, a dog his father had almost sold because it wouldn't obey commands the traditional way. Owen had spent 3 weeks figuring out that the dog needed to be shown things, not told them. It was a visual learner, and once Owen started training it that way, it had become one of the best working dogs his father had ever had. His father had looked at him afterward and said, "You didn't train that dog. You understood him. The dog trained himself." Mara was quiet for a moment after he told her that. Then she said, "That's what you do, isn't it? You wait to understand what an animal is before you decide what it should become." Owen looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Most people do it the other way." "I know. They decide first, and then they try to make the animal fit the decision. And it doesn't work," Owen said. "Or it works in a way that breaks something you can't see." Mara nodded. She turned her mug in her hands. "I think that's true of people too," she said. Then she seemed to consider whether she had meant to say that, and she decided she had, and she left it there without apology. Owen did not say anything right away. He looked at Grit, who had settled at his feet under the table, in a proprietary way that still surprised Owen. The dog had decided something, had made Owen a part of his territory, and the decision seemed final, and somehow like a very high honor, from an animal who gave very little for free. When Owen finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "I've been doing this for 15 years, he said. "Breeding, training, placing dogs. And this is the first time I've sat in someone's kitchen and thought—" He stopped. "Thought what?" Mara asked. She kept her voice even, because that was who she was. "Thought that I would like to come back," he said. There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that has weight and warmth both. Outside, the valley was white and gray, with winter light. Inside, the wood stove ticked. Grit exhaled deeply under the table, the sound of a dog who is exactly where he intended to be. Mara looked at Owen across the table. He looked back. Neither of them looked away. "You can come back," she said. She said it simply, the way she said everything, without decoration. But her eyes were clear and warm and steady, and Owen Holt, who had made hundreds of decisions in his life with absolute certainty, felt something settle in him that he had not known was unsettled. He nodded once. Grit shifted under the table and put one small, sweater-covered paw on top of Owen's boot, and left it there. The valley noticed. That was the thing about Caro Valley that you could never quite forget, the way it watched, not unkindly, but with that particular thoroughness that comes from a place where people have known each other long enough that new information lands like weather. You felt it before you could name it. Owen's truck had been seen on Mara's road twice in 1 week. Pete Calloway had mentioned the photograph to 2 people, who had mentioned it to 4 more. By Saturday, the market square was carrying the low, warm current of a story in motion. Not gossip exactly, but awareness. People noticed things, and then they looked for more things to notice, and what they found was this. Owen Holt, who had always been generous with professional advice, but private with everything else, was spending time at the cottage at the end of the gravel road. And Mara Elliott, who had always been warm but self-contained, was letting him. Grit, for his part, was indifferent to the valley's interest. He was 12 weeks old now, and had developed a daily routine with the focus and commitment of a professional. Morning perimeter check of the cottage. Breakfast, which he ate with no drama but also with no wasted time. A run in the yard that had become increasingly impressive in its precision. He moved the same way a fast river moves, choosing the exact path of least resistance, and taking it without hesitation. Then a period he seemed to have set aside for what could only be described as thinking. He would sit near the wood stove and look at the middle distance with an expression of deep consideration, occasionally shifting his gaze to Mara, occasionally to a spot on the wall that apparently held some meaning only he could access. He had grown, not as much as the other pups in the Calloway litter. Pete had shown Mara photographs when she had bumped into him at the feed store, and the others were already noticeably larger, wide-shouldered and energetic in the way of young dogs who had never been uncertain of their survival. Grit was compact. He would always be compact, but his legs were strong now, properly straight, and his chest had filled out in a way that suggested the depth of the animal he was becoming, rather than the smallness of the one he had been. Owen noticed all of it in detail. He had started coming every few days, which had shifted without discussion into every other day, which was now sometimes every day, when the light lasted long enough, and neither of them had a reason to end the afternoon early. He never arrived with ceremony, and he never stayed past dark. He brought things sometimes. The special food, a length of strong rope that he thought Grit would like to pull on, a book about the history of border collies that he had found in his own shelves, and thought Mara might find useful. She always received these things the same way. She looked at them, said thank you, and did not make more of it than it was. He liked that. He had not known he would like that. He had spent most of his adult life around people who made too much of things, either in the direction of performance or in the direction of complaint, and he had always managed by simply paying less attention. With Mara, he did not need to pay less attention. He could pay full attention, and the full attention was returned with the same quality. Grit was the reason they were in the same room. They both understood this. It was also no longer the only reason. This they understood too, in the way that you understand a thing before you say it, in the quieter layer beneath words. The first time Owen brought Grit to the ranch, it was a practical decision. He had told Mara that he wanted to see how the dog handled the space, the open fields, the other animals, the specific sounds of a working property. A dog that would live the life Grit seemed built for, needed to know that world. It was a real reason. It was also the only reason he gave her. She put Grit in Owen's truck herself, settling him on the bench seat, with a firmness that was affectionate. Grit sat upright the entire drive, watching the road ahead through the windshield, with an expression that was entirely appropriate to someone seeing the world for the first time and finding it exactly as they had imagined. Owen drove in silence. He was aware of Grit on the seat beside him, and also, more quietly, aware of the space where Mara was not. He told himself this was a practical observation. He was not entirely convinced. The ranch hit Grit like a wave. Not the bad kind of wave. The kind you have been waiting for. Every sense the dog had lit up simultaneously the moment Owen opened the truck door. The smell of the fields, the sound of the other dogs in the yard, the wind carrying 20 different messages at once. Grit did not jump down in a rush. He stood at the edge of the truck seat and took it in, systematically, the way he did everything. Ears first, then nose, then eyes, moving in a slow sweep across the property. Then he jumped down. Colonel, who was 7 years old and had seen every kind of dog come through this ranch, came around the corner of the barn at his measured pace and stopped when he saw Grit. The two animals looked at each other across 10 feet of yard. Grit was perhaps a quarter of Colonel's size. He did not behave as though this was relevant information. Owen watched very carefully. The two dogs approached each other without aggression, without retreat. Colonel sniffed Grit along the standard lines of introduction. Grit allowed it for exactly the time he thought it required, and then reversed the process. Then they both stepped back and simply looked at each other. Colonel's tail moved, a single, slow sweep. Grit's ears settled from alert to neutral. Owen exhaled quietly. He had not been entirely sure what would happen. A dog Grit size meeting a dog Colonel size could go any number of ways. What it had gone was this: two animals recognizing each other as serious without any need to prove it. Colonel was old enough to know what he was looking at. Grit was young enough that there was no history between them, no competition, only the clean exchange of two dogs measuring each other honestly. He called Mara that evening. She picked up on the second ring. "How did he do?" she said instead of hello. He told her. She listened without interrupting, which was something he had noticed about her. She listened all the way to the end of a thing before she responded to it, which meant when she did respond, she was responding to the whole thing rather than the piece she had been waiting to react to. "He and Colonel," she said, when he finished. "That surprises me." "It surprised me a little too," Owen said. "But it makes sense. Colonel doesn't have anything to prove, and Grit doesn't feel the need to pretend. They understood each other," she said. "Yes." A pause. Then she said, "How is Colonel lately? You said he was slowing." Owen looked out the kitchen window at the dark yard. "He's comfortable. He's not in pain, but he knows something is changing. You can see it in the way he watches things. He's storing them up." Mara was quiet for a moment. "That's a kind way to see it," she said. "It's the honest way," Owen said. She did not say anything for a moment, and he did not fill the silence. This was something that had developed between them, without either of them planning it, the comfort of silence. Most people he knew made sound to fill space, as though quiet was a problem. Mara treated quiet the same way she treated everything else, as information. "I could come to the ranch this week," she said, "if that would be useful." He said it would. He said it too quickly and then did not take it back. She came on Wednesday. She brought a dish she had made, some kind of bread, warm, wrapped in cloth, and set it on his kitchen counter without any ceremony, and then went out to the yard with him and walked the fields with Grit between them. The dog moved with his nose close to the ground, reading the land with a focus that pulled both of them along behind him, almost without their meaning to follow. At the far edge of the eastern field, Grit stopped. He raised his head. He looked at a point in the tree line on the far side of the fence, his ears straight, his entire body quiet. Owen stopped beside him. Mara stopped on Grit's other side. All three of them looked at the tree line. A deer stepped out of the shadow between the trees. A doe, young, careful, testing the air. She saw them, three still figures standing in the field, and looked back without moving, for what felt like a long time. Grit did not bark. He did not move. He stood like a held breath. The doe turned and walked back into the trees. Grit watched the place where she had been for another 30 seconds. Then he shook himself, turned, and looked at Owen and Mara with the expression that meant, "Noted," and kept walking. Owen looked at Mara across the space where Grit had been. She was already looking at him. The afternoon light was going gold at the edges. The fields were the color of late winter, giving way to something else. She had flour on her sleeve from the bread she had made that morning, and her hair was loose around her shoulders in the wind, and she was looking at him with those clear, steady eyes that never tried to be more or less than what they were. He said nothing. She said nothing. They walked back together in the fading light, with Grit between them, and the valley was quiet, and the bread was still warm when they got inside. Spring came to Caro Valley the way it always did, not with announcement, but with accumulation. One morning, the frost did not return after the night. A week later, the first soft green showed at the base of the fence posts. Then the morning smelled different, and the light through the kitchen windows came at an angle that it had not had since autumn, and Grit began sitting at the back door earlier in the morning because there was more outside worth paying attention to. He was 5 months old. He was not large. He would never be large. But he was built in a way that you felt before you processed it. A solidity and a clarity of movement that made your eye follow him whether you meant it to or not. He ran the fields at Owen's ranch now 3 mornings a week, and in those fields he had found what he was. Not a show dog, not a pet. Something more purposeful than either. An animal that understood space and speed, and the relationship between attention and outcome. He had begun to move small groups of sheep at the edge of the eastern field, not because anyone had formally trained him to, but because he had watched Colonel do it and had seen something he recognized as his own language. Owen had watched this happen the way you watch something that confirms what you already believed, but surprises you with its timing. He had told Pete Calloway. Pete had driven out to the ranch on a Saturday morning and stood at the fence of the eastern field and watched Grit work a small group of 6 ewes along the fence line, with a focus and a reading of the animals that was, Pete later said to his wife, better than dogs he had seen with 2 years of professional training. The ewes did not panic. They moved. Grit moved behind them, and beside them, with the quiet authority of an animal that understood its role so completely that it did not need to perform it loudly. Pete had been quiet for a long time. Then he had taken off his hat the way he always did when he was choosing his words. "Owen," he said. "I know," Owen said. "That dog is—" "I know," Owen said again. Grit wore the green sweater. That was the thing the valley kept coming back to. On cold mornings, and on the days the wind came in sharp from the north, Grit wore his forest green sweater as he moved through the fields and down the fence lines. It had been washed and dried and worn and washed again enough times that it had taken on the specific character of a thing that is used, the wool a little more settled, the seams worked in, the color deepened from the washing. It was not pristine. It was the opposite of pristine. It was the kind of thing that was clearly made well, and had clearly been used well, and was none the worse for either. The men who came to Owen's ranch, and they came regularly, to look at dogs, to discuss breeding, to ask for training advice, had opinions about the sweater in the beginning. They expressed these opinions the way men in working communities express opinions about things they find unusual, with short, dry humor that was more testing than mean. A dog in a sweater. Was it going to move sheep or judge them? Had someone taught it to knit its own next one? Owen said nothing to these comments. Grit ignored them entirely. And then, inevitably, the men watched Grit work. And after that, the comments stopped. Not because anyone ordered them to, but because there is a specific kind of silence that falls when you watch something do what it was made to do with complete authority, and that silence does not leave room for the smaller, easier sounds of doubt. The man who had made the sharpest joke, a rancher from 2 valleys over, a broad, weathered man named Clifton who had been breeding dogs for 30 years, watched Grit work for 45 minutes at the fence line of the eastern field, and then turned to Owen and said, in a voice that had lost all of its earlier lightness, "Where did that dog come from?" Owen told him, "The Callaway Runt, 8 weeks at death's door. Mara Elliott at the end of the gravel road." Clifton looked at the dog. Grit was moving along the fence line in a wide, clean arc, reading the animals ahead of him with an unhurried accuracy that was making Clifton's own well-trained dogs look, by comparison, as though they were guessing. "And the sweater?" Clifton said. "She made it," Owen said. "In the first winter, when he was too small to hold heat." Clifton was quiet for a moment. "It suits him," he said finally, and he meant it. By the time the valley's spring market came around, Grit had become something that people drove out of their way to see. Not as a spectacle, more as a confirmation of something they had started to believe. A farmer from the north end of the valley stopped his truck one morning at Owen's fence line and watched for 20 minutes, and then drove on without saying anything at all, because what he had seen did not require commentary. A woman who trained therapy dogs in the next county heard about the runt from Caro Valley, who was working sheep at 5 months old, and drove out to look, and went home and told everyone she knew. Nobody mentioned the sweater as a joke anymore. Several people asked Mara if she would make one. She got 3 requests in the first week after the market, then 6 more. 2 women who ran small holdings with dogs that struggled in cold weather. A man who had a lurcher that had never fully put on winter weight after a difficult puppyhood. A couple who kept goats and had a young sheepdog with a thin coat. Mara sat with this for 2 days before she said yes. She said yes because it was useful. Because the work was work she already knew how to do, and she could do it well. And because there was something deeply satisfying about the idea that a thing she had made out of care for one specific animal might extend outward to others who needed the same kind of care. She was practical about it. She set a fair price, she was clear about the timelines, she measured every animal herself or asked for precise measurements that she trusted to be accurate, and she knitted each one to the specific dog, not to a pattern. Owen watched all of this happen with a feeling he could not entirely name. What he could name was this, that Mara Elliott was the most quietly capable person he had encountered in his adult life. Not in a way that announced itself or competed with anyone, but in the deep, steady way of someone who knew what they were good at, and gave it fully, and expected nothing back but the thing done right. He had told her this. Not as a speech. Owen was not a man who gave speeches. He had told her, one evening in her kitchen, when she was finishing the measurements for the lurcher's sweater, and he was sitting across from her, watching her work. He had said, "You know what you're doing, and you do it without needing anyone to see it." And she had looked up from her notebook and looked at him for a moment, and then she had said, "So do you." And that had been the whole of it. But it had not been nothing. Owen had asked her, on a Tuesday in early spring, if she would walk the north field with him. The north field was the furthest from the barn, set at the top of a long, gentle rise that looked back over the valley. He went up there sometimes when he needed to think about something without interference from the smaller daily details of the ranch. He had not taken anyone up there before. He had not realized, until he was asking her, that this was significant. She had said yes without asking why. They walked up through the field in the late afternoon, with Grit between them, which was where Grit always positioned himself now when both of them were present. A single perfect point between 2 poles, equidistant, as if he had calculated it. At the top of the rise they stopped and looked back at the valley below. The ranch, the road, the line of the tree, break to the west, the pale line of the river beyond that, and somewhere east at the end of a gravel road, Mara's cottage with its smoke. Grit sat between them and looked at the valley too. Owen put his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the view, and then at Mara, who was looking at the valley with the same attention she gave everything. The wind moved her hair. The light was going the deep gold of spring evenings when the air is still cold, but the sun has been working all day. He said, I would like this to be a regular thing. She looked at him. This, he said, not gesturing at anything specific. Just this, the word doing the work. She looked at him for a long moment with those steady, clear eyes, and he looked back without flinching, because he was not a man who flinched from things he meant. This already is a regular thing, she said. I mean with intention, he said. She held his gaze. She thought about it, not because she was unsure, but because she gave real things real time. Then she said, yes. Just that. Yes, no decoration. No hesitation. Yes. Grit, sitting between them, looked from one to the other with what was almost certainly not human comprehension, and was nevertheless, somehow, completely knowing. He looked at Owen. He looked at Mara. He looked back at the valley. And then he stood, stretched forward with his full chest in the way he always did when he had completed a circuit of something, and found it satisfactory, and walked a few steps down the slope with his nose up, reading the evening air. The valley was going quiet below them. The last light ran gold across the fields. Owen stood beside Mara on the ridge and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. She was there, and he was there, and below them was everything they had both spent years building, carefully, without shortcuts, into something worth protecting. And between them, at a distance of a few steps, a small dog in a forest green sweater stood, with his chin up and his ears forward, looking at the whole of the valley as if he had always known it was his. He had started as the dog that would not survive, the runt in the corner of a cold barn that everyone had already counted out. He had survived because one woman had walked through a door she had not planned to walk through and made a decision that most people would not have made, for an animal that gave her nothing to go on except the fact that it was still there, still breathing, still pressing itself into the warmth of whatever warmth was offered. And then he had done the rest himself. He had grown in the specific way of things that are not forced into a shape, but allowed to find their own. Compact, clear, utterly without apology. He had chosen his people with the same careful, unrushed certainty with which he did everything. And once chosen, he had never revised the decision. He wore the sweater that had been made for him with the ease of something that had always been his, because in the truest sense it had. It had been made by hands that had understood him before the world had decided what he was worth. He was not the biggest dog in the valley. He was not the fastest or the loudest or the most decorated. But if you stood at Owen Holt's fence on a cold morning and watched the small black and white dog in the forest green sweater move through the eastern field, the way he read the animals ahead of him, the way he placed himself exactly where he needed to be without waste or excess, the way he stopped at the far end of the field and raised his head and looked back toward the ranch with total certainty, you did not think about what he had almost been. You thought about what he was. And what he was, by every measure that mattered, was complete. Mara finished the lurcher's sweater that same week. Then she started on a dark navy one for the goat farmer's sheepdog, who had a white coat and would look, she thought, very clear in navy against the snow. She measured. She chose the wool. She planned the reinforcement pattern based on the specific shape of that specific dog's body and movement. She worked in the evenings, now mostly at Owen's kitchen table, which had more room than her own, and Owen sat across from her doing his breeding records or reading, and neither of them needed to fill the room with anything, because the room was already full. Colonel lay near the fire. He was slower these days, moving with the careful deliberateness of an animal that had decided to spend its energy on the things that mattered and release the rest. He still went outside every morning. He still raised his head when Owen came through the door and let his tail move once, slowly, like a flag at ease. He still watched Grit with something that Mara had decided, weeks ago, was respect. Grit slept between the two dogs when all three were at the ranch, between Colonel's large, steady warmth and the empty space that he clearly considered his own. He curled tightly, nose to tail, sweater still on, the way he always slept, as if even in sleep he was compact and purposeful, and saving nothing for later that was needed now. The valley kept watching. This was what the valley did. And what it saw, on an ordinary spring evening in Caro Valley, was this: a light in Owen Holt's kitchen window, and two figures visible through the glass, one working with her hands and one working with a pen, and at the end of the gravel road a cottage with its chimney going, and in the eastern field a history written in tracks that the frost had not yet erased. The quick, sure marks of a small dog that had decided, very early and with great certainty, that it was not going anywhere. The valley had watched enough of the world to know what that meant. Some things survive because conditions are perfect, and some things survive because they have, somewhere in the deep center of themselves, already decided to. The runt from the Callaway barn had never waited for permission, and had never required an audience, and had never performed its resilience for anyone who happened to be watching. It had simply lived. And in living it had changed, in small and permanent ways, the 300 acres, and 2 hearts, and 1 old dog, and 1 whole valley, that had the luck to be present when it did.